All right, Chris Wasko, welcome to the Personal Success Podcast.
Thanks, Ryan.
It's great to speak with you. I'm really excited about this conversation. Who is Chris Wasko and what is her mission?
It's a great question. I feel like I've lived so many different lives in this life alone. My background is in business. So if you were to tell me that it was eventually going to be in the spiritual world where I would be seeing dead people and seeing people's energy bodies, I don't even know if I would have believed it myself. But essentially, I am a spiritual counselor, an energy healer, and a psychic medium.
Awesome. And so for those of us who aren't 100% clear, right, what does it mean when you say a psychic medium?
That's a great question because a lot of people will use the words interchangeably. From what I was taught and what I understand, someone who is psychic has the ability to read energy, to read emotions. For me, I can read people's chakras. I read their energy body. I could read moods. I could look at a picture and tell you about the person. I could get a name and tell you about the person. So psychic is usually a very present thing. There's different aspects of being psychic, like precognition, predicting future events, that kind of aspect. So I think it's just a matter of where people find they fall in that regard. Mediumship is you are literally serving as a medium between worlds. So that's usually people that are speaking to those in spirit, speaking to angels, speaking to ascended masters, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it seems like, I don't know, the first thing I think of is I feel like it seems like a responsibility. It seems sort of almost like a burden. Does it ever occur that way for you?
Do as much mediumship anymore. When I started really evolving on this path, mediumship was a primary source for me because I felt like it was really guiding me on my path. Believe it or not, I just one day was starting to see dead people in my mind's eye, and it was a little jarring at first. I didn't know how they communicated, so I really didn't know. I was out of my realm, really. You start to learn energetic boundaries. Once you do that, that's not really an intrusion that you think it is. But in the beginning, I think it's a little overwhelming. At least
Yeah,
it was for me.
I could certainly see that. I think, the story of how you first discovered your gift here, what was that? What was that like for you? You said it was like all of a sudden one day. It wasn't, was it associated with an event or a change in life, or I don't know. How did that come about?
It was a process of healing, really, because what I learned for myself is my trauma from growing up really muted all of my abilities. When you hear of people that have say they've been doing this their whole life, I'm not one of those people, but I absolutely have instances and memories of things that happen that I couldn't quite explain, or I probably would have chalked up to coincidence. But healing my nervous system, especially from my trauma, allowed me to connect in a way that I wasn't able to before. It really was a pivotal moment of cutting off my incredibly narcissistic parents, who are very abusive. And doing that led on a healing journey. So it probably took a good, I would say, 2 to 3 years in this healing journey where I was calming my nervous system, learning my trauma responses, really helping myself. And then it was opening me up to spirit. So the one day it was more of, I was suddenly seeing dead people. But prior to that, I was still healing other things and I was still opening up to spirit. I just didn't realize it at the time. I just wanted to feel better. I didn't want to be in fight flight anymore. I had been
Yeah.
there my whole life. I was done.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that right there happening in life is something that really goes along with my story. I just was looking back now. I thought I didn't realize I was in survival mode or fight or flight, and I just kind of, it's interesting because, just yesterday I'd recorded an episode of a podcast with a coach, and he had asked me some questions that, we were talking about like core beliefs, and I brought up the point. I said, I still have this core belief that, it's like a worth belief, right? Like I'm not worthy or whatever. And I was like, yes, does that ever go away? Just asking him. And he kind of, after we were done recording, he's like, listen, I need you to do this thing, and so it was funny because I was looking up the worth and whatnot. And I'm a yoga teacher. And so I know a little bit about chakras and whatnot. And that's sort of the what I could get is, self-forgiveness and self-compassion, hence the green today. And then we're talking with you, and you mentioned chakras already. How did that play a role chakras and this kind of how did that play a role for you personally in healing?
That was definitely part of my evolution in healing because I knew basics in chakras. Like, I think we all have seen the picture of the seven main chakras, what that looks like, what they are, maybe. So, when I was working, well, I started working, is I was finding that a lot of the people that were finding me were dealing with narcissistic abuse or childhood trauma. So what I started to realize is I was feeling their energy body. But so I would just get hits in my own body because when I connect with somebody energetically, it's essentially our chakra systems and our auras are connecting. So once that happens, and that's with anyone, it doesn't, you could be psychic or not. I think we all have the ability to be psychic. It's just a matter of whether or not we're open to it. But once we are connected to an individual, we are connected by a cord already. It could even be an acquaintance. It could be just a one-time meeting. We all connect with these cords. So once we connect, we can then read the energy of the other person. And I'm sure a lot of people already do this. You kind of know instantly, like, oh, I'm really going to hit it off with this person, or the opposite. Like, I don't like this person at all, even though they haven't given you any indication of why. But when I realized I was already able to do that very easily because I grew up in a household where my body became conditioned to reading moods, to reading my dad. Was he going to flip out today? Was I going to get hit? Those kind of elements, they really was one of the things I guess I'm grateful for now. It helped me read energy. What I realized is I was reading people's chakras. I started jumping in from there, really studying and realize what I was feeling and, kind of aligning my feelings with now education of like, okay, now I'm understanding this, understanding that. So when I do energy reads on people, what I do is I'm looking for the elements of their chakras that are off. I'm looking for the imbalances. I'm looking for the fractures. I'm looking for the hurt. I'm also looking for the good because I work with so much trauma, I feel like I kind of become a little abundant in that. So I like to also look for that good. I like to look for what makes that person tick, what ignites them, where's their passion, and those elements.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought it was something that stuck out to me in kind of researching your work it doesn't seem to the outside, to anybody on the outside, it doesn't seem how like, a psychic medium or a spiritual counselor, it's not exactly clear how that overlaps with like a narcissistic behavior. And it seems like it just is part of your experience. So that's just kind of what was attracted to you. Where am I off on that, Chris?
No, you're right. I would say it's a lot of my experiences. I've had people that have told me they've never had a read like I've given them that is very unique because I really like to help people heal, but not in the sense of I'm the healer. I like to give them tools. I like to lead them to, where these imbalances are off in their body. I also will connect with the elements that will help them. I'm often guided in that way. I'm guided in also the things that will not help them. I feel like do so well when we have tools. I'm very big on somatic practices. I'm very big on the body being able to work with the body to heal it. The body tells us so much if only we can listen. And I know how to listen. I know how to find it. And I like to really first educate people because awareness is key in any healing journey. Okay, I've got this. Now, what am I going to do with it or about it? And then taking those steps to heal that. So, I've had people call me a therapist, and I always say I'm not licensed, I'm not certified in any of that. But they'll be like, oh, yeah, Chris is essentially my therapist because I am listening to a lot of the things they say. I'm finding these elements in their body. So I feel like it's like a body therapy because the body just tells us so much. Our emotions tell us a lot. Absolutely. There are things the body says that we don't always remember or we don't always connect to realize, oh my gosh, that seems so subtle, but it's a big part of me.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. And the reason being is because I try to explain this to people, especially other men. I was single at the time I became a yoga instructor. And I remember Midwest family, my dad, God love him, is like, are you becoming a yoga instructor to meet women? Like, and because I was talking about it and it was just, I realized it was not sinking in. But one of the things that was really clear to me was there's certain poses or asanas where emotion would suddenly just spontaneously arise. And I just would realize, oh my gosh, I just have much more bodily awareness. And I know how it's funny because now I use somatic, when I'm monitoring for stress or things like that, I use like, oh wow, there's a tightening here. What's happening? I'm thinking about this is going to happen, and then I can sort of start managing it there. But it is it's a whole other level of awareness. And I think even me being, I sort of have this draw to, even the spiritual side of it, something larger than me I can't understand or put language to exactly. But there's this other side of myself, which, actually I've kind of brought along for the journey. And I kind of I'm like, okay, well, what's going on here? And I really got to thinking of Carl Jung, where he talks about, listen, most of it's below the surface, but really, these things that pop up above it are all from our subconscious, and you can access that through dreams and emotions. And I think there's a practicality to that. It seems like this, when I asked you what kind of led to this journey, there seemed to be like a clearing of, I don't know, that's just the word that came to mind, that suddenly just opened up something aligned within you or something that, I don't know, this is just kind of my impression. And then it seemed like it occurred to you then that just anybody could kind of have this kind of alignment, but it happened to you. So what was that
Yes.
like to experience that?
Incredible. It really was life changing. It changed my entire life. And really, it's because I made the most difficult decision I've ever made in my life. Cutting off my parents was not easy. And it took time because, I grew up in a very volatile environment. And, that became my normal. So when my dad hit my first child, that should have been my I'm done. And it took another 8 years because one of my conditioning, two, they're my parents. I really wanted to have a relationship with them. And I really wanted them to be a part of my children's lives. But that should have been my no more. That should have been my boundary of I'm not doing this anymore. But it wasn't. I chose to forgive. He did apologize. It's probably the only time he's apologized for something in his life. And I chose to continue a relationship. And it took another 8 years. And there was another incident. He didn't hit anybody, but he threatened to hit my husband. And that was I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. My family is not safe. But it was so incredibly difficult. I cried. I was anxious for the first time in my life because cutting off my parents, I have very vindictive parents, a very vindictive mother. So my fear was, what is she going to try and do to me? What is she going to try to do to try and get access to my children? And she did do a lot. And it wasn't easy. I was terrified. I was anxious. And I was trying to heal from those. I wasn't in any kind of spiritual realm of thinking at that point. It was just, I was still in survival. So I was doing little things each day to try and help myself not feel like I was in danger or that my family was in danger. And that was a really huge part of my journey. And having the bravery to take that step and not go back to those old patterns because they were normal and because I was conditioned to believe that I was a terrible daughter. I mean, I was already believing I was a terrible daughter, and here I was now cutting them off. So that was really sealing the deal on that kind of program and understanding of myself, and also ultimately leading to an undoing of that belief that no, I'm actually pretty amazing daughter. I let you in my life even after you hit my child.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make me feel like a great mother, I'll tell you that. I'm still forgiving myself for that one, but it's part of my journey and I accept that and I accept where I'm at. But the healing has been incredible. I'm just, my only regret is not cutting them off sooner because it changed my life for the better. I have so much peace. I have so much happiness that I didn't even know was possible. I was already happy in a lot of ways. I have a really good marriage. I love my husband. I love our family, what
Yeah.
we've created together. But cutting off my parents and healing from that changed so many other elements. I became a better wife. I became a better mother. I became a better human being in so many ways. So that pivotal moment changed everything.
Yeah, that when I heard that story, I really that resonated with me because, I get along famously with my parents now, but it was very much my childhood was very much like yours, right? There was a lot of, hitting and yelling, and then, I was the oldest of 6 boys, and so, there's I used to tell this joke, which I'm almost like ashamed of, but it'll illustrate the point. It's like, yeah, I've given all of my brothers stitches except for two of them, which I gave them stitches twice. And it was like, I was walking around like that was a point of pride growing up, you know? And, but it just was, there was kind of this violence that was sort of involved in that. And, you know, I didn't plan on really having children, but now I'm so, you know, everybody told me, you know, because I happen to be around coaches and people, they're like, you're just going to, all you know is how you were raised. So it's going to come out. And I'm constantly vigilant of, oh my gosh, this is really hard to sort of contain here. And I've had to really just, you know, I'm always watching, right? Because I want them to have sort of a different experience. And it just, you know, really, I want to just acknowledge how difficult that would be to be like, okay, mom, dad, sorry. This is, you know, this is not healthy for us. You know, I love you, but here's the boundary that can't be crossed. So I just want to kind of highlight how difficult that had to been.
I appreciate that because setting boundaries with parents that were already squashing your own boundaries, and now you've created boundaries for your own family, especially your children. If they didn't respect yours, they're not going to respect your children's or the ones you've created for them. And that's, I think, really challenging. And, but that also means if we're allowing those boundaries to be crossed, that we don't respect our own boundaries. We have to learn how to respect our own boundaries first. And that's also understanding our energetic boundaries. We have energetic boundaries, and we don't always see those. I obviously can because of what I do, but energetic boundaries are very important because it means you're aligned to them, you feel them, you're not kind of half in, half out with boundaries. The only reason we tend to break our boundaries is a fear of how we'll be perceived, a fear of how we'll be treated, underlying fears of not being loved, of abandonment. Those, you know, there's always deeper elements to that. But boundaries are an incredibly important part of the process of really understanding it and understanding how they were for us growing up, even if they were non existent.
Yeah, if we could, I want to zero in. I think I know what you mean by energetic boundaries, but if you could share an example to help kind of illustrate that a little bit.
Yeah, it's really any boundary you would have, right? So if you have a boundary of, you know, talking to someone a certain way or not, you know, like you've set this boundary for your parents to not yell at your children, for just as an example. So the energy will read that. The energy will be solid if that's not at all allowed. Whereas if it's somewhat allowed because you're not fully invested in the boundary, meaning like if, say, your dad yelled at one of your kids, you would maybe snap back at him. That means the boundary isn't solid. So the energy of that will kind of be a little wavering. It'll be a weaker element. A strong boundary feels like a brick wall. Like it would take a whole hell of a lot to get through that. And it's next to impossible for that really solid boundary on an energetic level. So it really, the energy of it will match the emotion of it. And not
Yeah.
everyone could read that, but they could at least understand it in themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you know, sometimes I tell my clients this. I'm a coach and I call it a personal success coach. Right? And so there was one time where I think, you know, sometimes when you're coaching, you hear some wisdom, some language puts some wisdom that's a belief that you haven't before. And I remember I was coaching this individual and I told them, I said, you know, what if the fact that you can't set boundaries is this person will never truly know you because, you know, you can say one thing and then act another, but you know, we really know each other through our boundaries. And I was like, wow, that's really what I think that's really true. That holds up in my life, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. We set up different boundaries for different people too. And sometimes don't even realize that. You know, it often depends on the type of person. But the more we understand ourselves and our own boundaries, are what we've created for ourselves in regards to others, is how we can then be better at aligning to our boundaries and not feeling guilty about them too. Yeah, I was raised to feel guilty about boundaries and also have severe punishment for ever creating one. So there was a lot of undoing of, you know, some limiting beliefs in that regard.
Yeah, I think there is in my experience, I believe that I was very close to the person who had narcissistic tendencies. And I was so deeply aware of the pain that it came from that it made it, it hard to exit that relationship. It made it hard to, you know, there was no sort of talking to them, you know, about any of it. There was just a constant sort of disassembling of me that was involved in that. And I think you get to a point, and I think that's what's so, you have people who are you raised in that, and you might call it codependent or something like that, but they sort of have that sensitivity to the pain that they're willing to sort of, take on so much. How do you help people become aware of that? If you agree with that, Chris, I
Yeah, I
kind of
do
assume.
agree with it. There's those narcissistic relationships are always coming from wounds. Narcissism in general is bred from wounds. And that's why these are generational patterns that carry on and on and on. It's parents parenting from their wounds. And until we can really learn to heal that and look at that, and it takes being self reflective. And depending on how far down, that narcissistic spectrum someone has fallen, because it is that. That's why, I've got two parents that are narcissistic, but are on opposite sides of the spectrum. My dad is a complete overt narcissist, borderline sociopath, and my mother's a covert narcissist. She's highly manipulative. They're both compulsive liars, but I really had to recognize that this was coming from the wounds. And when I was able to see how broken they were as people and really see them as children, they weren't born this way. They were made this way. And over time, we kind of just keep building on these other energetic layers to mask this, hence the narcissistic mask. That's why so many narcissists are so incredibly charming. They are so good at putting their best selves forward and hiding those wounds. So when they become more comfortable in a relationship and that codependency comes in and that enmeshment, that's where now everything is out there in the open, but you feel trapped in this relationship because you also know they're capable of these wonderful things because it's everything you see in the beginning of a relationship. And now you're in this darker part. So you think, okay, I know they have the capability. So you hold out for this hope it's going to
Yes.
get back to that beautiful, amazing place again. But it's getting into a cycle of abuse. So anyone that's been in that cycle knows it's a pattern. And we're all conditioned to be part of a pattern, and no matter what, whether it's narcissism or anything else, when we start to recognize our patterns is when we can create change in our lives.
Yeah, that's funny because what I was thinking of when you said that is I remember when I was learning this stuff about enmeshment and codependency and things like that, and how relationships really a healthy relationship looks like. I remember like I'm reading, I'm like, oh, this is really great stuff, but it's not possible. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is that program talking, right? That's the foundation that I'm working off of. Is like this is a great ideal to sort of head to, but yeah, it's just in a book. It's not sort of possible. And I really that for me was like a big turning point in understanding really what a relationship really is, and I think simply said, it's like two people really out there focused on being their best selves. What is soul development?
Soul development, I feel, is more evolutionary, where when we connect to the elements of our soul who are meant to be in this lifetime, we really then evolve as humans. So you're developing these aspects of you. You're growing, you're evolving, you're shifting, you're changing. There's so many elements to it. But I feel like you're also shedding a lot. You're shedding a lot of these energetic layers. You're undoing a lot of the subconscious mind programming. You are calming your nervous system. There's so many elements to it for each individual. I feel it's very unique because we are all different as humans, but there are still some foundational elements that are there, right? Like the patterns, the understanding of what we grew up with. Whether you're in a narcissistic environment or not, that was my journey. It's not everybody's journey, but when we are being raised in any environment, we are developing adaptation styles. We're adapting to an environment. A child doesn't ever point out a parent being wrong. They adapt to an environment in order to feel safe. That is what we do. That is a basic human element of being a child. And then when we start to grow into our own selves, is then now just the searching, the finding, right? Which is also why teenage years can be so tricky. You're now out, you've stepped outside of this adaptation, but now you're in soul searching element in ways, but also human searching element in ways. And if you have parents like I did, you're not allowed to be you. You have to be what they want you to be. So, there's so many elements. It really depends on the person. I've had so many different experiences with different clients, and it's really just getting back to who are you? Can you look at the mirror and just ask, who am I? And give an answer that doesn't into just like, oh, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, okay, great. Those are parts of you, those are roles you play, but who are you? And really getting to that is really getting to the core of who you are and who you're meant to be.
Yeah, again, I'm sort of speechless because I've talked to so many leaders and so many people who started on this journey, and I'll call it a spiritual journey. It might not have had the spiritual overtones that we're talking about, but and myself included in this, you get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm going to start at the beginning. Who am I? And actually, I I took that so literally. For years, I wrote on a blog called "Who Are We?" and I just was starting over again, and it was sort of like, uh, you know, uh, everything from wild, science fiction stuff to science to, spiritual things that I was because I kind of was doing my yoga training during this, and I think that it's so fundamental because. I heard the question presented another way. It's like, okay, I'm going to ask you a question. You can't tell me your name, your relationship status, where you live in the world, what your job is, anything that you would normally say. Now, who are you? And it was like, what do you want me to say? It was my initial response, right? But the idea is that okay, who are you? What? And this is so anti our culture. The way I answered it to myself is. I don't know what do I hear being called? I'm just sort of sitting here. And it was sort of to this work. I want to have conversations like this with people. I want to experience growth. I used the term at the time and I didn't understand it, like elevating consciousness, because I think there is a way where we don't have to be so slavish to our biology and things like that. And it seems like this is all sort of, I don't know, at least adjacent to sort of your work here.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. Sounds it. And pretty incredible that you had that. Who are we?
Yeah, for a while. I mean, it wasn't. I didn't have many people read it, but for me, it was a journey. It was the start of something because I was just like, okay, I'm going to start at that question. I'm going to, what is this? Who are we? What are we trying to do here? So you work with others to help them tap and understand their soul. So I wonder, what do you see? Is there any common denominators with what is blocking us? What is causing us to have to not have access to something that seems like it should be sort of natural?
Trauma. It's a very easy answer. Trauma. And we all have trauma. It's part of being human. It's a lot of why we are here. We are here to work through traumas. We're elevating through shedding these, through understanding them, evolving past them. Especially at this time, so many of us are becoming more aware of trauma, generally speaking, and this isn't about blame either. Like I don't point the finger at my parents. I believe in having that time of victimhood because, some pretty awful things that are done to us, I don't feel we're meant to ignore. I feel we need to have that time of being like, that absolutely sucked. How could they? I deserve better, all that, so it's just a matter of not living in that. And can you evolve past that? And can you see how it serves you, how it formed you? And what are you going to do with it now? Are you going to try and shed it? Try and do something with it? Or can you alchemize it? Be better, do better? There's so many aspects of that, but trauma is the underlying element to all of it. And it's not always childhood. It's often childhood. It's not usually just one experience. It's layers of experience. Some people can have the most amazing parents, but some people, I think enmeshment is one of the trickier ones, but I would say kind of a red flag in that, especially I see this a lot with women when they say, my mother is my best friend. And why that's a red flag for me, if you're married and your mother is your best friend, there's something already wrong in your marriage because that's not something a woman should say. And I say this as a woman who used to say that, but that's because I didn't realize I was enmeshed. And I didn't realize I was so hooked because my mother never quite energetically cut the cord to allow me to be an individual because of her own trauma. And that's what happens. Mothers latch on to their daughters a lot and definitely can latch on to their sons. And yeah, hence the Oedipus complex. But when we work through the traumas is when we really can get to the core of who we're meant to be because we decide what we want to do with that.
Chris, for those of us who might have forgot or just needed some clarity there, define enmeshment for us in in the way that you're using it?
So enmeshment is usually used in narcissism. It's essentially you are, from my own understanding, because of how I see it, you are energetically linked still to your parents. So there is a part of them that did not release you when they should have at the age you were supposed to. So it is an attachment style that I feel a lot of people don't see because, I'll feel the energy of it because what I'll feel is like you could give me a name and someone will give me the name of someone and then I'll feel the person and then immediately I feel a parent. That's enmeshment. I shouldn't feel the parent. I should feel something else. I should feel their career. I should feel their hobbies. I should feel their family, their pets. So if I'm feeling a parent right away, we're already enmeshed because that means the parent didn't unlink energetically at a point that they were supposed to or should have. This is usually around, I'll give some variance on this. We're taught that once you're 18, you're an adult. But most of us are still relying on our parents to pay for college, pay for us in a lot of ways. So I'll give some grace on that because a lot of us are different. Some people though hit 18 and they're like, I'm done, I'm out. And the parents give them that cut, that sever energetically. A lot of times it is until like 21, 22 when we're kind of like, okay, now you're
Yeah.
really in the world and
Yeah.
you've graduated college. This is society based and this is very general. Obviously, this isn't everybody, but I will feel that okay, that child or person, they're not a child anymore, but just for all intents and purposes, the parent child relationship, there should be a sever here that wasn't. And now they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and I still feel mom or dad. So it's that aspect of one parent or both parents never let go. Usually, most commonly, it's mom.
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
a reason for that too. There's an energetic connection mothers have that, especially if they burned the child, that fathers do not. You literally were attached. So to have that energetic detachment, and especially if you have a lot of fear. So a mother who has parented from fear really struggles to let go of a child. And so when they're out in the world, they stay very attached, and oftentimes in very unhealthy ways. But it's not usually looked at in that way because usually they're very helpful. They're the ones that are constantly there. They're the ones that are, they're like when a daughter has babies now and mom's right there and they're doing everything.
Yeah.
But what's happening is the daughter's not finding herself. She's constantly turning to mom. What should I do? Would you do this? Would you do that? Because the enmeshment is so strong, but they don't realize it. It looks like there's this beautiful friendship they have with mom. It's a tricky
Yeah.
one.
That's the thing about a lot of these things. They sort of they have a mask, I guess, is the good way. We talked about the narcissistic mask, but there's they look a certain way, like sort of maybe it's society or cultural that says that this is just acceptable. It's the way it is. But underneath, sometimes there's the parts underneath are causing issues or causing concerns. And I think that it sounds like when they realize this, they have to make changes in their lives. It seems like doing some of this type of work really can help on the healing path.
It can. I think a lot of people don't really want to see that though, because it feels healthy and, because who doesn't want a parent that loves them? But what if that love is coming from a wound? What if that love is coming from an attachment, not a genuine love of, I love you so much. I'm allowing you to live your life, not expecting you to live the way I want you to, or hoping you're going to live the way I want you to. There's such a fine line there, but energy doesn't lie. When the energy of enmeshment is there, I always feel a lack of that person's self. And
Yeah,
it's hard to explain.
I wonder, I've told this story on here so many times, so I'll try to be brief and have it be specific to what we're talking about. But I had my dad come visit me just after I turned 40. Maybe I was 41 or something. And I lived by myself and we went and had dinner the night before and he stayed at my house. And in the morning I went up and I would get up every morning and I'd run 10 miles and then I had breakfast made or whatever. And it was Saturday or something. And he's like, man, he comes downstairs and I'm like, oh, here's your breakfast or whatever. And I was reading some book or something. And he goes, your brothers think you're crazy. And I was like, what? And first of all, it was an interesting way to start a conversation. And I said, what do you mean they think I'm crazy? And he's like, well, I mean, you work 100 hours a week, you run 10 miles a day, your house is like spotless. He's like, what? And he's like, what did I do to you, man? And I looked at it, and I was confused. I was like, what do you mean? I'm this way because I'm your son. And I was like looking for it. And he goes, I never ran 10 miles before. And he's like, I never got up at 5 a.m. on a Saturday and I never worked more than 40 hours a week. So I don't know what you're talking about. And I was like, is he, at first I was like, are you lying? But somehow that's what I internalized him as, right? And like, he's like looking back, like it never was like, what that was so confusing to me. And I think I just, the way I explained it to myself is I just made it his acceptance bigger than it was something that grew in me. It wasn't something that was actually out here. What do you make of that?
Well, in that experience, I'm going to ask you, when was the first run?
When was the first run?
When was the first run?
Like the first run of my life?
The first run that you remember in terms of I ran fast, I ran long.
It's kind of funny because I didn't think of that. It was actually, I was in cross country when I was a kid, and he actually was like, I was not doing very well, and he was like, "All right, I'm going to go out with you." And we were running, and I thought I was doing great, and we're running along. And he goes, "Is this how fast you run when you're out there?" And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, it is." And he goes, "Okay, this is pretty slow." And I just remember I was like, I think I quit cross country shortly after that. I just didn't see it. So, but that's a great question.
But that's what you look at. Whenever anyone is a runner or an incredible athlete, I like to go to that, especially, just to use my own experience. My first big run, it was 5 miles. I was 16 years old. My dad absolutely lost his mind. He almost hit me, but didn't. I was like waiting for the hit, but he kind of took it out on himself. I remember he like ripped off his shirt, and he always wore button down shirts, and each button was like popping out. It was like watching a cartoon, and he just absolutely lost his mind and was screaming at me. And I just ran out of the house and I ran 5 miles. And I remember getting back. He's like, I must have really done something for that. And I was like, but there's always a story behind the first run, especially someone that's carried it into adulthood. And there's always a perfectionist element to it. Anyone that's an athlete, they have an element of perfectionism in them. And often it does relate to when you get down to those earlier stories. Where did that come from? You didn't just one day decide, I'm going to be the best. You chose it, and there's a reason you chose it.
Yeah. Wow. I never put those two events together before.
Give you something to reflect on
I'm
later.
processing
Yeah,
that, Chris. That's
that's
powerful.
something
That's
to sit
good.
with and chew on a bit.
Yeah. Right. Oh, I'm just, in order to give myself space to do that, I had asked someone very close to me. I was like, well, what would you ask Chris in this scenario, giving your background? And they were curious to what you would recommend for someone dealing with sort of religious trauma.
Yeah.
And I asked them to talk about what that meant. And they said that they see themselves as a person, and a woman, for example, not able to see herself not in relation to a man. They have ideas about healthcare that are harmful. It's their relationship with this trauma has caused them to swing sort of too far to the other side. And they find themselves having sort of an irrational anger or judgment against those who are religious. What is a path forward? This person is fairly stuck here.
So if I'm understanding fully, because I just felt like that already feels like I'm just gonna say right here, energetically, we've got at least 3 different things right there. It's not just the religion. That's just the one that's the element they've been able to highlight energetically. So that's probably meaning it's probably had the most impact, and I'm going like in this person, I could feel it's as young as 5 and it was big. So there's something there. So that's a religious wound that I would go to. There's also relationship wounds. They can't hold relationships for long periods of time. And they also self-sabotage. So I could, that's me reading the energy of this person. So this is like very specific. But if we're getting into just religious wounds in general, so religious wounds are often generational. And they are also in the soul. You could have had a past life where you had religious trauma and it's carried into this life. But for all intents and purposes, we'll stay in this lifetime. We have a lot of religious constructs. You have to be a certain way. You have to behave a certain way. And if you don't, you're evil, you're bad, right? I was raised Catholic, so I know this incredibly well, that you essentially have to behave a certain way or else you are going to hell. It's fear. It's all fear-based conditioning. So that's really what you want to look at is how has the fear impacted your life? Because in this individual that has asked this question, it seems like the fear, it's not a fear like I'm scared of it fear. It's a fear that controlled them, meaning there was a lot of religious constructs of fear-based elements controlling them, meaning it probably raised them. So there was probably a lot of fear based control in that person's childhood and then went and carried into life. So shedding that is really getting to, again, back to who you are. And that type of person is looking at themselves in the mirror, not thinking they're a good person. They're going to find the hypercritical elements of like what to break down of like, I don't like this about myself, I don't like that about myself. So it's amazing what these bigger things like religion can do to us on a personal level of really being able to look at, okay, this is what this has done, this is how I look and perceive myself, now what can I do to change it? Really unpacking those elements of the fear-based control, I would say, are a big start.
Yeah. It's almost, my impression, and I'm trying to keep out that I know this person well, but it's almost like they're so exhausted about thinking of how they're comparing to this religious ideal that their sort of parents have set up for them. And so they've rebelled against it, and they've tried to be in the middle, and they can't get away from this. It's like they're a puppet on a string.
Yeah, I mean, religious is a confine, it's compartmentalized, energetically speaking. What I mean by that is, we are put into these boxes energetically when we are raised under a certain religious belief system. And when we are in that energetically, it doesn't matter what it is. I'm not going into the rights or the wrongs or whatever, but it is what it is. It's what our energy becomes aligned to, but it becomes our truth. It becomes a version of our truth as we're growing up. So now when we're growing up further, aging, if you will, we are having things challenge those aspects because, our belief systems are starting to be challenged, or people we care for don't agree with it, or people we don't care for don't agree with it, and we feel we need to defend it, but it keeps us in this box. So when we can get ourselves out of that box, then we're out of the confine. We're out of the energetic confine because then we're just open. So you could still have a belief system. Like I have belief systems, but I'm not going to look at you and say, you don't agree with me, therefore you're wrong. I'm going to
Yeah.
listen and I'm going to be like, oh, how interesting. I'm going to be curious. Oh, that's such an interesting point you've made. That's such an interesting consideration. But I'm not going to try and prove you wrong because I disagree. If I disagree, I'm just like, oh, I don't really agree with that, but I understand your point and that's really neat. And then just move on because I'm not in that confine anymore. When you're in the confine of any energetic program, your beliefs are easily challenged and you feel like you have to defend them and fight someone for them.
Yeah.
And maybe you're not fighting it in the exact context of the belief, like, oh, you don't believe this, therefore I'm going to fight you. But there's some fight within you that's angry and it's trying to come out. So you act out and you're not always voicing it. But that's what energetic confines do. And religion is probably one of the biggest ones
Yeah.
because we're taught if you don't do it this way, you're wrong. And I don't agree with that. I believe the more we are open to others and the more we are willing to learn and expand and grow and not look at one way as the right way and just try to respect people as human beings, as long as we're all treating each other well, right? Obviously, there are people that do horrible things in the name of religion. So I obviously do not mean that, but it is a structure. Choosing to be within or without that structure is a personal decision.
Yeah, there's a through line here that I think is interesting, and that is, I asked the question about soul development earlier, and one of the things that I guess the reason why I asked that is it sort of it came from I guess I don't want to say skeptical. It's too, what does that mean? Whenever I hear the word development, I'm sort of skeptical, and so the reason why I say that is because it to me it implies a goal, right? I don't know. We're developing towards a goal, and I think the one thing that sort of helped me with that was there's a writer named Gabor Mate, which he had the Myth of Normal came out a couple years ago, and he said, "Listen," he goes, "There's no healed. There's the path of healing, or you're not on the path of healing." And I was like, "Oh, that's what he's talking about here." And so the through line to what you said is I often have trouble deepening this idea. And I think you just helped me with that, Chris, is that what we need as humanity right now is we need for, Chris to have one opinion and me to have the polar opposite opinion. And for us to be able to be in the same room and not just be in the same room, be able to connect as mature human beings. And that's sort of what I heard you say there to a certain extent.
Yeah, we all have a personal truth. And yeah, that's expansive. It's not just one thing we believe in, but we have personal truths as human beings. And when those personal truths are challenged, is when our nervous system reacts and we feel like we need to respond. We feel like we need to protect, defend, lash out. But if you are so within yourself and comfortable with yourself, your beliefs, and your nervous system is calm, you're just going to be comfortable with your personal truth and respect that other people have their own personal truths that may not align with yours. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you're not safe, but that's fear based. We're often taught that when someone doesn't agree with certain things, that they are wrong and they need to be attacked. COVID is probably a shining example of this right
Yeah.
now,
Yeah, it
in
is.
that
Yeah.
you needed to do a certain thing. You needed to be coerced to take a certain medical experiment. And if you didn't, you were wrong and you were therefore a threat to society. And look at how many people bought and believed that. But that was fear-based control. That is absolutely textbook 101 fear-based control. And when you learn that and you learn how, okay, all that happened was you had a belief system challenged. It doesn't mean someone else was a threat to you. You just chose to accept them as a threat and treat them as such. So when we can look at that in our everyday life, that was, of course, on a grander scale because it made people fear for their life, that made people fear for their safety. But that's how fear works. It doesn't have to be fearing death, but just fear is based on that ultimately. An underlying fear that you won't survive, an underlying fear that you're going to be abandoned, and abandonment ultimately means that you could not survive. So when we look at that within ourselves and we're comfortable within ourselves and we're not relying on others, we recognize, okay, my belief system's just been challenged. What do I need to do with this? You don't need to lash out at someone. You don't need to fight someone. You don't need to defend it. You need to look at, why do you feel so powerful in the sense that you need to protect this belief system you have?
Yeah. Well said. So I want to shift the discussion a little bit here. And we talked about, I've given you some great examples. You gave me some great insight. Thank you for that. It's interesting that you talk about how you came from sort of a business background and, I get that you weren't sort of always doing this work, but how does, just thinking about identity and our own truths and whatnot, what sort of things did you have to do to align with your own truth in order to sort of do what you do now your career, as your role, as your mission?
That's a great question, especially because of my background in business. I was basically raised, and not even raised in my household, but even just my education, that I had to be a certain way, act a certain way, and business has its own kind of constructs. And stepping out of that was being open in a lot of ways, being open to newness, being open to things you don't always have proof of, that you don't have concrete tangible proof of. I think being able to step out of that was pretty big for me, and also very empowering and also very freeing, because I really broke down a lot of limiting beliefs I had created unknowingly. And I was able to do away with some limitations by managing my expectations. Managing expectations generally is such a big thing. Sometimes it's just not having any expectations and letting life be is one of the best things we can do with ourselves, for ourselves. So yeah, I think it's been an interesting ride, and changing a lot of beliefs along the way was a big one. I think also I'm married to someone that is, it's funny because in terms of just being two incredibly different people, like, he's not at all spiritual, he's not religious. I I remember thinking, like, this is gonna be an interesting conversation when I tell him I'm starting to see people in spirit, but he doesn't judge. He more just, he withhold me, not that he never judges, but he will withhold judgment. He's all about learning, but he's also a man of math and science. He likes to see the proof, give me something to believe. But again, the openness was so important. So I think just as our relationship has grown and evolved, has been really big in that as well. So I didn't do it alone. I did have support of someone who loves me in that, and I think that was very helpful too.
So what is it like to work with you? How do clients find you? What is it like to start that sort of relationship?
So I'm finding a lot of people are actually finding me on podcasts these days or
Yeah.
through word of mouth. I don't market a lot. Because I mean, my website's my name, so it's pretty easy to find me. But yeah, a lot of people are finding me because one of their friends got an energy read and they really got excited when they heard about it. So they like to get an energy read to see what I find in their chakras. So that's been the popular one these days, I guess.
Yeah. And then so when that, what is like the first sort of session like when you kind of get to work with each other? I guess I'm just curious about that whole experience.
Yeah, it's always different. I could say that. It'll really depend on how where someone is at on their spiritual path. If someone is not at all spiritual, I'm not going to be going into like crazy woo-woo stuff.
Yeah.
I will be reading their chakras, but everything that I'm going to be saying to them is very relatable. Whereas as someone that's more evolved on their spiritual path, we're probably connecting to some goddesses, some ascended masters, some galactic beings. It really will really depend on the person. But again, that's their energy. I'm not the one bringing it. It's what their energy is open to and presenting. So I'm really just working with what they bring to the table, whether they know it or not. Sometimes I'll just ask, do you have something you want to focus on? Because focus can always make energy more direct. Like, okay, I'll go right to it. Or do you just want an energy read and I'm going to go through your chakras and see what they say? So some people like the focus and some people want to be like, oh, just tell me what my body is saying. So really that it really will depend on that. But I'm really just you know, sometimes I haven't even done like a full chakra read because we'll just sit there and I'll feel one chakra practically screaming at me. And
Yeah.
then I'm like, okay, we're going to go right there and we'll get into that. And then I'll feel stuff like, okay, I feel this, I feel that, I feel this. And then yeah, we'll go into that. I'm pretty big on not having people feed me information. So the less I know about you, probably the better,
Yeah.
because I don't want my thinking mind to get in the way, because as humans, we make assumptions. And I find that those assumptions are often incorrect, energetically speaking. So I like to not know too much. But as far as like, if people start asking me about other people in their life, this is where I'm very big on just having ethics in this kind of work. So let's just say you work with someone, I'll just call him Richard, for example. You're like, I want you to read this guy, Richard. I will not be going around your energy to read Richard's energy. I will be going through you to him. Because if I went right around to him, that could deplete his energy and that's an energy drain. And I don't think that's very ethical, but I'm going through you. So it creates a buffer, and then it's not like imposing on somebody else's energy in a way that I don't think is very ethical. So, because people are always curious about that, because I just need a name, and I will tell I can read someone pretty quickly, but I'm always very cautious of that because I don't. And people also, we're vulnerable as human beings. Once you have an energy reader that can really read someone's energy, I could get in and strip down, but I will always respect energetic boundaries. It's probably a lot of why I had to go through what I went through growing up, because
Yeah.
I never had my boundaries respected. So I will always respect everyone's boundaries, whether I know them or not.
Yeah, it sounds like you take that there's a certainly an ethical responsibility there that it seems like you would probably have to take just on your own. If you're if you're wondering about somebody and like, okay, what's the boundary there? You got to be able to draw those boundaries for yourself as well.
Yeah, and I don't want to take other people's stuff on. As
Yeah.
soon as I open myself up to somebody's energy, I am automatically open to their stuff. And I am an empath, so I have had to learn how to not take it on to where it really can weigh me down or be too much. So that has taken time and learning that and learning how to work with that. So, just yeah, in my day-to-day life, I tend to have a bit of a protection, if you will, so I'm
Yeah.
not taking on everybody's energies in everyday settings because
Yeah, right. Well, that's sort of like that burden that I mentioned earlier. It seems like it could be if you didn't have those boundaries, and that's why they're necessary just for your own well-being.
yeah, it can be. It definitely took some learning in that aspect of what not to take on, how not to take it on, and if I did take it on, what do I do with that?
Yeah. Yeah. What do you do with that if that were to
I have
happen?
to release it. So now I'm more aware because it will depend. Like if someone has a heavy energy and I'm still carrying that after the call, I know I haven't fully released it. So it'll feel like a weight. And because I work with a lot of trauma, that's pretty common. So I kind of learn how to kind of leave the weight at the session and leave it behind. If there's ever anything lingering, I should notice it within the hour. Like, I will notice my mood is different. I will feel suddenly tired when I should feel energetic. I will feel a little irritable or cranky, those kind of things. So then sometimes I'll do stuff in a visual aspect in my mind. I'm visualizing myself in light. I find detox baths are probably the easiest thing for me to release. I do very well with water release. So that'll be if it's really heavy and I'm not shaking it by anything I'm doing otherwise. So that's kind of my okay, I need to go take a bath.
I'm just really I'm taken aback by how well you have this. You've thought it out. It's like, yeah, I kind of thought. I mean, I guess I didn't have an expectation, but yeah, I got to release it, and that would be the end of it. But you have a process, and I'm sure it's even deeper than what you shared there. That's striking to me.
Yeah, it's taken time. In the past, I would have thought it was mine. I would have thought I was tired. I would have thought the session drained me. A session shouldn't drain me. I learned that. If a session drains me, then I gave too much in a way that I probably shouldn't have. And that's happened. Again, I've had to learn. I really have had to learn. Yeah, it's taken years of honing in on stuff and figuring myself out. And there's more to learn. I think that's a lot of why we're here. We're always learning, even about ourselves, especially about ourselves. So it's a process, and I think it will always be a process.
Who would benefit from seeking you out and working with you?
Anyone that's dealt with childhood trauma, anyone that's with narcissistic abuse, narcissism in general, anyone who feels stuck, because stuck means there's stuck energy. They feel lost. Depressed is also a form of stuck energy. Addiction is also a form of stuck energy. I'm trying to think of like the kind of client I tend to have. Those are probably the most common, but also people that are willing to change, because a lot of times we become so used to our own energy that it's hard to want to change it, even though if we have the want, but you have to do stuff, even if it's little stuff. I'm very big on little stuff. You can't, if you try and do a big change too fast, there's a rubber band effect where you snap right back into it. And that's like
Yeah,
essentially that's how self sabotage works. Your energy is still conditioned to the old version of you. So you're kind of like yanked back to it when you're trying to make changes for yourself. And then we're harder on ourselves when we feel like we failed because, okay, we tried to make this change and then we snapped right back to those self sabotage principles we have. But again, that's your old energy, and your new energy is trying to now mold and take form. But you have to do that slowly in a processed way. You try and do it overnight. Some people can. I'm not going to say that's impossible, but it's rare. Most people, think of it like dieting. If anyone tries to go on like a crash diet and they lose like 100 pounds in a very short period of time, why statistically most people will gain that weight back and then some? It's because their energy wasn't adapted and it didn't get to adapt. And those few people that do manage it is because they were able to snap into that newer energy much more effectively than others. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just means that your body was so comfortable in that energy.
well, Chris, I'm mindful of our time here. I just want to kind of give you the floor to address anything that you felt needs to be said.
Yeah, I one thing I always like to say to people is be easy on yourself, be kind to yourself. You've done a lot. I work with a lot of really heavy things and we are always hardest on ourselves. So if we can give ourselves even the slightest bit of compassion, I think we do a lot for ourselves just in that. And I know how challenging that is, but usually you see worse in yourself than anyone else ever has.
Yeah, beautifully said. Well, thank you so much for your time. You said we can find you online at chriswasko.com. Is that where
Yes.
people can look you up?
Yeah. Yeah. That's the easiest way to find me.
And of course, all this will be in the show notes and things like that. So thank you so much for your time. It's just so you've given me a lot to think about.
Thank you. This has been great. I appreciate the time.